Thank you. Yeah, so as has sort of been said, my name's Josh Connolly. The way that I thought I'd do this today is just, to be honest with you, is to kind of just share my experiences with you, right? And to kind of get you to understand what I experienced and then what I believe would work, particularly for young people now based on the experiences that I have, right? I want to also say as well that it's I'm really sort of genuinely, not just saying this neither, pleased to get the opportunity to speak here, right? When I see men come together like this, people of my age and younger are really, I was just saying when we sat down, really, really lacking these spaces, right? Some of the work that I do in my life today is starting to try and create spaces like this in some way for men to come together. I never had it growing up, and particularly as somebody, and I'll go on to tell you a little bit about some of this, who never had a father figure of any kind. I didn't know how to be around men, right? I certainly didn't know how to communicate with men on a level where I shared my struggle, yeah, and could allow men to be there for me. I found men actually quite scary and very untrustworthy, and that would make sense based on my experiences, so I think when you hear them. The work that I do today, I work a lot in like the corporate environment, so I get the opportunity to work with like some big brands, but I'm really passionate about going into schools as well and working with young people. I think the more that we can do that, the better. I was at a school today in London, not today, this week. Over the course of 2 days, I spoke to about 1,800 students and the parents, and as was mentioned earlier, this problem is huge now with young people. It's really, really huge. So, like I say, really the way that I do things is to share with you my experiences of how and why I ended up where I did and what I believe kind of led that. At the age of 24 years old, I very nearly took my own life, and I'll talk about that in a moment, about what that looked like. I was very lucky that I had an experience with my children that kind of changed everything for me. But after that experience, I wanted to look at my life and try and make sense of how and why I got to where I was, right? I believed at that stage of my life that my addictions that I struggled with were like some sort of genetic predisposition. I thought I was just born that way, right? I always would have said that my childhood was idyllic. There was no real difficulties when I was a child. And so, it must have been something that I was born with. And what I began to realize very quickly when I looked back at my life is that a lot of the narratives that I created, a lot of the things that I said about myself were ultimately to protect myself from my ultimate truth. I didn't grow up in an idyllic childhood, right? It wasn't idyllic. It was very, very difficult. My dad was an alcoholic. He was a violent, chaotic man who scared me when he was drunk and scared me when he was sober. And the reality is for me is that I always wanted to have a dad, right? And so I created narratives around it to try and protect myself from it. And when I look back now, I lived with a younger brother who was a year and a half younger than me and an older brother who was a year and a half older than me. And we spent most of our time upstairs when I was at home. And you did that because you didn't go downstairs. And you didn't go downstairs because it was too frightening, it was too scary, and you never knew what you was going to get, right? I learned very quickly that the rules of the house that I lived in was that you don't talk, you don't trust, and you don't feel, right? And it wasn't that anybody ever sat me down and said, these are the rules of the house, right? My mum never wrote them on a piece of paper and stuck them on the fridge. I learned them by the ways in which I interacted with my parents. I knew consciously, though was never told directly, before I even started school, that what went on in my house stayed in my house. It was a big family secret and we kept it within the household and never told anyone. I learned not to feel by, let me give you an example. After a particularly bad night, let's say my dad had smashed the house up or there had been some kind of domestic abuse, my mum the next morning would be frantically trying to act like everything was okay, right? She'd say, this isn't your fault, I don't want you to worry about this. She'd say, your dad was just a bit angry last night. And then she would say something like, you're okay, aren't you? And when my mum said, you're okay, aren't you? She wasn't seeking to create a space for me to explore my emotions, right? Emotionally, my mum was full and she was seeking for me to validate her need for me to be okay. And as a young boy, I sensed and knew that. So I didn't just say I was okay. I showed her everything was brilliant all of the time. And I learned very early on to push my emotions down, to not talk about them and to show up for my mum in the way that I thought that she needed me to be. I grew up to be a young boy who was really good at being there for other people, completely incapable of being there for myself. Hypervigilance became a real thing for me. Yeah, I could tell you how drunk my dad was by the sound of his breath. I could tell you how drunk he was by the way he put the key in the door, by the sound of his feet on the stones outside. I knew when I was upstairs if my mum was screaming in fear and when she was screaming in anger. I knew when she was screaming because violence had just happened. I was hyper tuned into that stuff, right? I recognize now as well that I've always been like very sensitive as well. Sensitivity is largely misunderstood in our society. We think sensitivity means shy, right? We think sensitivity just means kind of somebody that's meek and mild. I'm talking about sensitivity that ultimately means I'm very sort of in tune with other people and the ways that they feel. That becomes a huge problem when I've grown up in a environment that teaches me that when I feel somebody else's feelings, that it becomes my responsibility. Because I used to come home and be looking at my dad, be trying to check in the tension in the house, who's going to set him off. I lived in an environment where I walked on eggshells all of the time. And that walking on eggshells environment meant that I was desperately always trying to control the ways that other people felt. I did that by abandoning myself and turning up in their actions. Now, I believe that children have two innate needs, and the first one is attachment to their parents or primary caregivers, right? From an evolutionary point of view, we wouldn't survive, right, if we didn't have that attachment, right? When we're born, we are completely dependent upon our parents, right? Completely dependent upon them. And so we have to attach to them. That's not a desire. I don't want the love of my parents, right? It's a biological need for me to attach to them. The second thing is authenticity. Authenticity at its core is understanding what I'm feeling, knowing what I need as a result of that feeling, and then being able to communicate that need within my relationships and my activities, right? All babies are authentic. When they need something, they cry, and they get what they need. I believe the problems arise for a lot of us when that authenticity threatens the attachment to our parents or primary caregivers. It's the authenticity that loses out every time, right? Simply put, if I think by being myself I won't get the love of my mum and dad, then I won't be myself. And what you start to learn is you don't need a dad like mine who was an alcoholic. An emotionally inept parent will do it, one who can't be with you in your emotions. A stressed one will do it. A parent who works too much will do it. A parent who sits looking at their phone 24 hours a day and never looks you in the eye will do it. And I think, we was just talking about this when we sat down, I think we need to talk a lot more about device use, not in kids, in adults, particularly between the ages of 20 and 40. Because I don't know what the figures are, and there probably isn't any proper stats out there. But I'd say that most people in that age range are pretty addicted to their phone. And the messaging that children are getting when they look up at their parents, and their parents are like that. I can't imagine how I would feel now when I'm talking if you were all on your phone. I would think, you don't care about me. You don't care about what I've got to say. Right? And I'd probably stop saying it. And then how would I communicate my pain? Right? How would I talk about that? Well, I wouldn't have it. I wouldn't have it in my life. And I think when I grew up, what I had is, because of the way that my dad was, nobody ever helped me comprehend the ways that I was feeling. When I was sad, there were people over the other side of the world that had it way worse than me. Yeah. When I was scared, I was always told there's nothing to be scared of. If I was anxious or overwhelmed, I was told, wait till you get into the big wide world. You don't know what overwhelm is. And if I was angry, then I was often told, if you carry on behaving like that, you can get out. And so I grew up not knowing who I was when I was in my emotions. Whenever I felt them, I pushed them back down into my body because I couldn't deal with them. And I remember once the police had turned up at my house, right? My dad had smashed some of the windows through. He had a knife and he was trying to get in the house. I was about 4 years old. I came down the stairs. I was halfway down the stairs and I was watching what was going on, right? And the police did what they were very good at, which was restore the peace, yeah? They took my dad away and they restored the peace of the situation. But on this occasion, one of the police officers came in to me on the stairs. At that point was probably going beyond his duty, his sense of duty, right? He came down to my level. I was terrified, absolutely, shaken to the core by what was going on. And he said to me what I think most people would still say in that situation. He said, don't worry. There's nothing to be scared of. We're going to sort your dad out and everything will be fine tomorrow, I promise. And what he did in those very few sentences was completely devalue everything that I was experiencing. I was 4 years old. I was absolutely terrified. He was telling me there's nothing to be scared of. My experience told me that not only was it not going to get better the next day, it was going to get a damn sight worse. And he was promising me that it'd be fine tomorrow. Now, I used to say the only reason why he would say that is because he was a good man and he wanted everything to be better for me. I think both of them things were true with this police officer. I think he was a very good man. And I think he definitely wanted things to be better for me. I don't think that's why he said what he said. I think about the ways in which I interact with people in the work that I do today. I think about the ways that I interact with my son, for example. My son's 10 years old. Very sensitive, yeah, feels things very deeply, very emotional. And I remember once he said to me, I feel like everyone in this house would be better off if I wasn't here. And when my son said that to me, I was like, you don't have to think like that, right? We all love you in this house. I love watching you play football. Your brothers and sisters love you. We think you're an amazing boy. You don't have to think like that. And I do exactly what the police officer did to me when I was on the stairs. And I used to say the only reason why I do that to my son is because I love him more than anything and I want everything to be okay for him. Never more true than in this case. That's not why I say it to him. The reason I hit my son with the positivity and tell him everything's going to be all right like that is because when he tells me how he's feeling, I can't deal with the way that it makes me feel. And I'm trying to bring the energy levels back up to something that's more manageable for me. And when I finish saying all of them nice things to him, what do I say at the end? You get it, son, don't you? And I do exactly what my mum used to do to me when I was a kid. And a week later, when my son comes to me, and I say, how are you? Is everything all right? He says, yeah, Dad, I'm fine. I start saying, my son won't speak to me and I don't know why. He won't speak to me because a week before I told him, don't come to me with those emotions because I'm not ready for them. What he needs when he's struggling with his pain is for me to step into his darkness and sit with him for a while. Not to fix him, not to change him, not to make him feel like he's broken, but to remind him that he's a human being and his pain makes sense if we really look at it deeply. To ask him questions, why do you think you're feeling like this? To metaphorically hold his hand so he can explore the way that he feels, not shut his feelings down and say that they're not welcome in the house. Because that's not directly what I said, but that's what I was telling him. And we do this on a societal level, by the way, with young kids. We do it with everyone, actually. We do it with each other. We smother emotions, don't let them come out, and we all get to feel a little bit better about it. When actually, there's a range of emotions. They're there. We feel them. We experience them. We need to feel supported in experiencing them. Now, my dad spent some time in prison. When I was 6 years old, he was in prison for a couple of years. When he came out of prison, he went with an alcohol problem. He had quite a bad heroin problem when he came out of prison. We have a tendency to think, oh no, it got worse. When I was a child, I didn't know what heroin was, but I know when I saw my dad smoke this stuff, I actually felt a little bit of relief. Because he was way worse when he drank. Way worse than he drank. I'm not trying to tell you heroin's better than alcohol. I'm just telling you that one's highly legal and addictive and overused by a lot of people. Yeah, and the other one's highly illegal. And you get way more stigmatized for a drug problem, by the way, than you will an alcohol problem. I went on to have a problem with alcohol myself. I haven't drank for 10 years. When I used to go in the pub with four of my own children, sit them in the corner, get them a bag of crisps and a can of Coke each, make them sit there all day while I got absolutely obliterated drunk. Nobody ever said a word to me about it. I go in a pub today and order a can of Coke and say, no, I just don't drink. Everyone wants to talk about it. We live in a society where it's more strange for a father of 4, I've got 6 kids now, but for a father of children to be sober than it is for them to be an alcoholic. Right? That's the way that we view alcohol within our society. How is that any different to drugs? One's criminalized, right? And the other one's not. I'm not trying to say either are good, but I'm trying to show you, right? And I used to go and visit my dad at his flat on the weekends. I knew as a young boy my mum wanted me to have a good relationship with my dad. I knew it would break her if we didn't, so I never told her what went on in the flat. She used to say, how was the weekend? I'd say it was fine. It wasn't. My dad used to wake up in his own urine and his own vomit. He'd have people in the house. We'd end up in different houses. I wouldn't know where I was. I was 8 and 9 years old. I remember feeling the deep-rooted shame that I used to feel when we'd be out with my dad and the way that people would look at us. I was taught at school about people who drink and do drugs. We once did an exercise, it's different in schools now, but we did an exercise when I was at school. An outside firm came in and we all had to draw what we thought a drug addict looked like. A drug dealer looked like, and we stuck them all on the wall. And I sat in the classroom and looked at all these pictures on the wall and I knew what the world thought of me. Because these were pictures of what they thought my dad looked like. So it's no wonder I kept it a secret. It's no wonder I was shrouded in shame. And when we used to go out, I used to feel guilt that I couldn't pump my chest out in an act of defiance and say, don't look at my dad like that. And of course I couldn't do it. But I grew up to be a young boy and eventually a young man who had this over-the-top band of brothers mentality. Don't look at me like that. That's what I used to say. I used to be that person in the pub was saying that, and everyone would say, why is he like this? Who is this idiot that's looking at, that's getting angry with the way that people look at him? And don't get me wrong, at 19 I probably was an idiot, but But you see, the point that I'm making is that what I was reacting to was not necessarily based on my experiences in that moment. It had a lot to do with the experiences that I'd had in my life. When I was 9 years old, I was at my dad's flat, and to cut a kind of traumatic story short, I saw my dad take his own life. And when I saw it, I didn't phone an ambulance because I was so worried that if I did, then I knew that my mum would know what I'd seen. So I didn't phone an ambulance. I waited in the flat, and eventually my mum rang the phone in the flat, and I said, "Dad's really, really drunk. I need you to pick me up." And she picked me up out the front of the house, and 2 days later I found out that my dad had passed away. Now, at my dad's funeral, lots of people told me to be brave. Adults told me to be brave. Some of them told me to be brave for my mum. These were well-meaning adults, but they were literally telling me to be emotionally available for my mum when I was 9 years old at my dad's funeral. It's not the right thing to say. What do I think adults or people in general mean when they tell anybody to be brave from an emotional standpoint? What I think they actually mean is, I don't think I could deal with the emotion that I know that you need to express. So I'm going to tell you to be brave, you'll keep it in, and I get to feel more comfortable. When people tell people to be brave from an emotional standpoint, it comes from a place of fear. They're scared of the emotion themselves. And that comes back to the things that I was saying about the ways in which I interact with my son. If we really want to make big change for young people, we need to get in there and help them comprehend their experiences, give them meaning to their emotions, be there with them in their emotions and make them know that they're still human, that they're allowed to feel them, and that they're not as scary and nobody's ever really died from emotion. But we don't tend to do that. We tend to think that when somebody's struggling with the ways that they're feeling, we've got to make them feel better, rather than to help them be better at feeling. I was never going to drink. I was never going to use drugs. I was never going to do any of that. We like to say that people fall into the wrong crowd. I don't think I fell into the wrong, I didn't fall anywhere. We like the word fell because it makes it sound like it's nobody's fault then, right? It's just, they just fell, there's nothing we could do. They fell into the wrong crowd. I went to the people that were struggling with the same thing that I was. Every young person that I used to hang about down the park, they were all struggling with the same. It might not have looked the same exactly, but they were all struggling with the same kind of thing that I was. Some kind of emotional abandonment from a father or a mother figure. All of them, without fail. Not all of them had a father that wasn't there. Some of them had a father that worked too hard. But we were all struggling with the same thing. And by the time I was 12 or 13 years old, I'd been screaming out for somebody to give me support. I didn't have enough about me as a child to say, I'm really struggling emotionally and I need support. I was just naughty at school. And I get sent into schools to do early intervention. What we call early intervention is me sitting in a room with a 13-year-old who started smoking drugs and drinking alcohol. That's not early. That's late. Why? Because smoking drugs and drinking alcohol kind of works in the moment. When you've lost all hope in life, and I say to these young lads, when you're 21, your life will be a mess if you carry on drinking and using drugs. They think, couldn't care less about being 21. And the drink and drugs works in this moment and gets me through this day. Of course they think that. So for me, one of the big things that we need to do is look at what early intervention really means. I go into infant schools sometimes and I say, do you want me to come and work with some of the 5 and 6 years old? They say, no, they're too young. And if these 5, and we know that 1 in 5, by the way, 1 in 5 children are living with a parent that drinks hazardously. Hazardously is enough to harm the people around them. 1 in 5, right? That's the studies. So if a child is living with a parent that drinks too much at the age of 5 and 6 years old, it's not too early for somebody to go in and try and help them comprehend their experiences. In fact, you better get in there and help them comprehend it as quickly as you can. Why? Because a child has 2 choices when their parent can't be emotionally available for them. The first one is to admit that their parent can't be emotionally available for them. The second choice a child has is to make it about them. Maybe if I try really hard at school, maybe if I play really good at football, maybe if I support the right football team, maybe if I'm really funny, right? And I guarantee you that each and every child, every single one of them without fail, will always pick choice 2 because it's much safer. Because why would they want to admit that their parent can't be there for them? And so these children grow up thinking there's something wrong with me. And you don't need an alcoholic parent, remember, a parent that won't look up from their device. And the child comes home and says, this thing happened at school today, and the parent says, and these aren't necessarily bad parents because I do it, I'm a parent and I'm guilty of it. I say, oh yeah, what, did you do a picture? Yeah, show me it. Oh, that's really good, yeah, well done. What am I teaching this kid? And what are they slowly going to learn about themselves? Yeah. We think, by the way, that as parents or as supporters of young people or as adults, right, we think our responsibility is that we've lived life, so we've seen how it goes, and we've got to teach them how to live their life. That's part of the responsibility, but I don't think it's the biggest responsibility. I think the biggest responsibility, particularly as parents, grandparents, or supporters of young people in general, is just how much a child will abandon themselves in order to attach to you. That's the responsibility. Because if a child is looking for that attachment and is looking for you to love them, and for whatever reason you don't show up to that, then there's only one thing they're going to think. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? We just come out of an 18-month period of lockdown, right? One of the things that we thought about doing was introducing Latin into schools. Now, Latin might be a good thing to teach children, but where's the space? Where's the space for the 18 months that they missed out on being a child and learning and comprehending who they are? I went on to have a terrible problem with addiction in my life. Had a terrible problem with alcohol, particularly alcohol, but drugs as well, but mainly alcohol. And I always felt to some degree like my problem was drink and drugs. We have a tendency to say that. We try and treat the symptom, right? We think if we can just get rid of alcohol and drugs, but they wasn't my problem. My problem was a lack of connection, a lack of feeling part of something, a lack of feeling wanted, a lack of feeling needed. But what do we do to young boys and girls who have lived a life of shame, who have lived a life where they've never really feel connected to anyone? They've always felt like they're not part of. What do we do to young boys? We segregate them first, normally. We take them away from the environment that they're trying to be in. So we say, you're not good enough to be in this environment, to further cement their shame. And then, largely speaking, we shame them. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we used to plaster them across the front of a newspaper and call them an ASBO, antisocial behaviour. Yeah. So we exasperate the exact thing, the very thing that's causing their problem. Trauma is not about what happened to me, it's about what happened inside of me as a result of the things that happened to me. It's an internal wound. It comes from the Greek word meaning wound, by the way, trauma. And so if the trauma that I experienced was physical and you could see it, and somebody wheeled me into the room and said, look at him, and you could see how visibly I was traumatized physically and how much pain I was in, everybody would jump around and gather around and give me support and say, look, this person cannot live in this world on their own. They need help and support. But if your wound is internal and you can't see it, and I walk into the room and everyone says, what's wrong with this person? What happened to them was ages ago. Surely they should have come to terms with it by now. You'd never say that to somebody that might still have the physical wounds. You would never say that to them. And so one of the things that I think that, we need to do, particularly for young people and children, is build community again. Because we live in a world now where if your mum and dad can't be emotionally available for you, there's a very good chance no one else will. Because community's dying in our society. And the last 2 years have exasperated that, have hugely exasperated that. People are going more and more insular. But the news tells you it's very scary out there. So everybody starts going in and in and in and in. And we need to find ways to build community again. By the time I was 24, and I'll finish with this so that we can do questions. By the time I was 24, I was living on a fold-out bed at my mum's house. I was £17,000 in debt. I was 9 stone, which is 5 stone lighter than what I am now. And I didn't want to be here anymore. And I made a decision on the 14th of May 2012 to quit drinking alcohol and stop taking drugs, and I never went back to them. But my life fell off the edge of a cliff. I couldn't deal with the ways that I felt. And I think this is really important. When I was struggling internally, I didn't go meek and mild. Because there's this whole thing out there now that it's okay not to be okay, and we're getting people to talk about when they're struggling. But it's only really okay not to be okay in our society if you're still quite attractive and your behavior isn't too bad. But when I was struggling, I'm outwardly not very nice. I tend to hurt the people closest to me, right? And I'm not very attractive. And I never resonated with a mental health problem. I started having real bad panic attacks, and I made what felt like a very honest and noble decision to take my own life. And I went to see my 4 kids for the last time, and because I knew I was going to die, and it was done, I'd planned it, I was ready. The past became irrelevant and the future was non-existent. And for the first time ever in my life, I was present. And I want to bring it to this moment to kind of finish it before we do questions, and the importance of presence. I found presence in that weekend because I thought I was going to die. And I was with my daughter. I remember cuddling her and feeling it for the first time ever in my life. Like I was here. I felt that connection. I felt that warmth. I remember my son going down the slide, and when he got to the bottom, he looked at me, and I realized how connected we were in that way. And my life began to change after that weekend as I changed my mind. Because more importantly than changing my mind, I realized what was killing me was coming from inside. It was that emotion stuff, yeah. And in the 10 years that have followed then, I've always been very clear about who I am and what I'm struggling with. I realized that in most cases, my pain makes sense and that can be traced back to a lot of things. My anxiety disorder, for example, looks a lot less disordered when you look at the disordered environment in which it first existed in. Actually, it made a lot of sense. And let me definitely finish this time by saying this. When I got sober, and the 10 years that followed, I've done a lot of stuff. I've started the business that I've got. I'm, quite successful in what I do. I'm able to take my family all to different places in the world as a result of the things that I do. And I thought that would be the thing that made me feel whole and made me feel like I, always wanted to feel. But the truth is that the biggest, most meaningful moments in my life today are the moments like when I'm sat playing snakes and ladders with my kids. And I come round after about 10 minutes and I think, wow, for the last 10 minutes, I thought about nothing else other than being here with the kids and playing snakes and ladders. And those moments for me, if I'm honest with you, are fleeting. And I've absolutely slated devices and mobile phones and all that. And I'm just as bad as anybody. And life has a way of pulling me away from that presence. And I think ultimately the goal for all of us should be to be as present as we can with people. Because it's in that presence where real connection is made and real change happens. So thank you for listening in the way that you've listened. I've gone a little bit over what I sort of said that I would, I think, in terms of questions, but we got some time for questions. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw them at me, and don't feel like any of them will catch me off guard. I welcome all of them.
George, snakes and other thing, and you reference the presence made me think of looking at the demographic here and grandparents. Have you got something to say about the role that we can play for our youngsters, our grandchildren particularly, to compensate for what our busy parents might be up to?
So I work I volunteer as an ambassador for a charity called NACOA, which is National Association for Children of Alcoholics. Okay, so it's a charity that supports anyone affected by parents drinking. I do a lot of work with them. I've changed policy in government as a result of doing it with them, right? The reason I'm telling you that is because I've spoken to literally thousands of young people affected by parents drinking. I can tell you that the adults that I speak to, the ones that have kind of made it through, I'm generalizing a bit, but it's quite clear. The ones that have really made it through and aren't, I was going to say nuts, but that's probably the wrong term to use in the work that I do, but that haven't really gone off the rails, talk about a grandparent. And they talk about that relationship with their grandparents. So I'm giving you an extreme example, but it's one that shows you the high importance of grandparents. And I'm not just saying it because of the demographic. I think once upon a time, we lived in a society where mum and dad went out and did the hunting or did whatever they had to do in the day, and the children stayed at home with the wise old elders, right? I think that's how we're supposed to live. So actually, I think it's of high importance. I think it's of high importance what grandparents can do. And you tend to be at a stage of your life now. When I look particularly at my father-in-law, he talks about when he was a young dad and his kind of lack of patience and the patience that he now has when he's with my kids and what he's able to do. I cannot rate the importance of it enough, right? And I think it is just that presence. And it's that making time. And I can see it in my kids. They just love how focused granddad is when he's here, because he is more focused than me and their mum. Because we're up in that busy life stuff, right? We have to really make an effort. Let's make an effort to really be there and be present. When granddad comes over, the kids are the center of the house, no matter what. So I think it's of huge importance, yeah.
The grandchildren are quite close by, and COVID lockdown as well has impacted that relationship. I lost out on that ability to be present as much as I was before.
Yeah.
Come back obviously now, but
yeah.
Nearly 2 years older.
Yeah.
It's all changed.
Yeah, and I don't think that was in the conversation enough with the way in which we tackled or have tackled COVID. I think we very much went into survival mode. We were talking earlier about emotional needs and our kind of psychological needs. We call them needs, but just treat them like desires, right? Because if you think of the things that we need for our physical needs, when we approached the pandemic, no one would have said, we're going to have to cut water off for about 18 months, right? Because everyone would have gone, no, we need that to live, right? But everything emotional, we sort of said, all the emotional needs, we said, no, we'll cut them off as if we don't need them. And, some of the things that I don't see being talked about are the psychological effects of that. Because brain development, happens at its fastest rate, particularly in the first 4 to 6 years. In the first 9 years, and brain, is fully developed by 25. We know now that it can change, and it's called neuroplasticity, so things can change after that. But the development that happens in them first 4 to 6 years, when these young people's brains were developing for the last 2 years and we took everything away from them, I don't know. I feel like the children, were sort of left out of the conversation altogether through the last 18 months, and that I find it a little bit upsetting, to be honest.
I think also it's two ways. I actually think, particularly in my wife, in terms of the lockdown, being denied access to a grandson, then only 2. That really played on her mentally. Is that as far as she was concerned, anything physical she thought was that it was more important to be able to hug a grandson.
Yeah. And it's just as important that way. But both ways. Yeah. And it is because I think we're wired for connection. And I think when you take that connection away, I think it has a real adverse impact on us. And I think we've gone in. I don't want to be too controversial in the way, because COVID's like a really difficult conversation to talk about. But I worry that in the last 2 years, we've forgotten the importance of living because we've become so terrified of dying. And, I look at my nan, for example. She's regressed in the last 2 years, in my opinion, because of what's happened. In her kind of, she's now quite scared of going out, not because of COVID, but just because she's been in for 2 years, and I don't think she's ever really going to build the confidence to go back out. And, you look at the studies and all the kind of different studies that are out there that show the importance of connection, the importance of skin-to-skin touch, right? The physical healing in it as well. The physical healing in being in this kind of presence, in this setting with other people, right? If you were struggling emotionally, internally, with any kind of mental health struggle, it's going to be harder for that to get worse if you're sat in one of these chairs in here today than it would be to be sat in a chair on your own at home, right?
I've seen an awful lot of it, because I'm one of the mobile COVID testers, so I'm going around. I'm seeing people who are living alone, who are scared.
Yeah.
They don't go out week to week. I do a survey. They may all go. Some people just have not gone out. Still.
It's frightening. It is, yeah.
You talk about the importance of connectivity.
Uh-huh.
A lot of youngsters, not oldsters, would regard social media as being a lubricant to connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you talk about social media as being a real block.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Because a lot of young people would die if you took their phone.
Yeah, much like a lot of alcoholics would die if you took alcohol away from them, right? There's a lot to unpack, because the first thing that I would say is that I don't think social media is wholly bad. I think it can be a lubricant in the way that you talked about. But I think it's very, very new still. And I think it's very, very largely misused, right? There has to be the connection at the end of whatever community that we might create online. So I'm involved in some sober communities that you see online. People meet online and then they go and have big events where they come together and they're sober ones. That event, then connection has been born out of that, right? But the problem that you've got is like algorithms on social media, right, that are literally built to show you what it thinks you need for you to buy something. That's social media exists because it's an online shop at the end of the day. It doesn't exist to connect people, whatever the message that we're fed. That's not why they're a business, right? And it is a business that now is in a place where, for you to want to buy anything, you need to think that you're lacking something in your life, right? So you go out and buy it. Social media, literally, the algorithms on that are set up to show you stuff, to make you think that you're not good enough in some way, so you go and buy whatever is advertised on there. That's targeted marketing and algorithms. So when you look at it like that, it's a huge problem in that sense. And the addictive nature in it, they have psychologists and stuff working in these departments to make sure that they're addictive, to get you coming back to them. So in that sense, it's just largely misused, and I think it's a huge problem. I hope, to give it some hope, I hope that we can adapt as people and start to use them and find ways to use them in a much more healthy way. I don't see it coming at the moment, if I'm honest with you. So again,
it's not a substitute to this sort of gathering amongst young people. No. So what opportunities are we creating as society for youngsters to gather physically?
We're not. I don't think we are. Actually, I took my 15-year-old daughter goes to the same senior school I went to. I took her to school the other day, and she pointed to this building out the front, and she said, that's where we go if we're put in isolation. I said, all right, that used to be the youth club. And she said to me, what's a youth club? And I was like, what? What do you mean? She said, I don't even know what a youth club is. And I thought, wow. And then you look at like the way that the funding that we take away from children. I was saying here, Action Against Poverty charity believe that there's 1 in 3 children living in poverty in our country. In our country, the 5th richest democracy in the world, 1 in 3 children are living in poverty. So I think the ways in which we underfund our children and undersupport them and undervalue the need to give them things to make it to adulthood in a way where they're not desperately traumatized, I think it's a huge problem. The funding to children's services over the last however many years, it's just gone like that. And I've been doing this for a few years now. I used to talk about this a lot, and people would say, yeah, but it's difficult because where does the money come from? There was the famous line, there's no magic money tree, but they found that, didn't they? They found that when they thought that the problem was bad enough. And I think the problem is bad enough. If you dealt with addiction properly, which I think starts mainly in childhood, if you dealt with that properly, if you dealt with the mental health crisis that we see, because look, I think people die of untreated trauma all the time. We just call it suicide or liver failure or drug overdose, right? If you look at the pressure on the NHS to make it about money, because that's what it becomes at a political level. If you look at the pressure on the NHS from the ways that we don't support children, it all stems from that. Even obesity. We think that people overeat. I've seen what the government did is they printed calories on food, right? As a way to say, look, so everybody knew how much calories in there. And you think, right, that's quite good. Then recently they've been talking about maybe printing how far you'd have to run to burn a Mars bar off on a Mars bar, right? So then I think, oh, right, you think the people that overeat just not very good at maths. Like when I overeat, and I think, we all have the ability to do it, but when I overeat, it's because I don't feel very good about myself. And I'm escaping into food. So where does that come from? Well, it comes from the ways that I feel. So when we look at all of that stuff, prisons, 1 in 3 children are living in poverty now. In 20 years' time, when there's more crime, we'll all be going, I don't know why is there so much more crime? I don't understand it, right? Let's build more prisons and get more police. Well, why don't we just use that money now to try and get rid of the poverty in the kids? Yeah, because then we'll make change. But to bring it back to the question, we have to come together as people to find ways to do more for young people. We have to do it. It's too easy for us to say social media is the problem. I think it is part of the problem. But the solution is not take social media away, because that ain't going to happen. The solution has to be, let's find ways so that young children don't have to feel like they need to go and get validation from a device. One way of doing that is people my age coming off their devices when they're at home. You know?
I mean, it is frightening, is that when all of us were young, there wasn't a quantitative way we could judge as how well liked we were. Every kid is seeking, the number of likes, the number of followers. And equally, when we had lockdown, is if we actually, talking about getting together, when we saw a group of teenagers sitting around in the park, we generally told them to break up, didn't we? Seems sort of threatening somehow, maybe. But actually, really, they were probably emotionally needed.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And that's, when we talk about like stigma around mental health and stuff, what traumatized teenagers often look like is groups of kids hanging. Not all of them, but a lot of them look like groups of kids hanging down the park, being antisocial. Right? So they're not attractive, and it can be annoying, right? And it can be threatening and all of that, right? And we need to understand that there's consequences always, and we need to look at that and say, why are they down there and what's going on? And to bring it back to what you were saying about, like, when you were younger and stuff like that, if you had emotional stuff going on, there was a lot of like space in your life where you had to kind of try and at least comprehend it or deal with it. Kids don't have to do that anymore. I've got a feeling, right? And when you do that and you're looking through social media, whatever that feeling was, I'm not feeling it, right? So I'm just numbing myself, yeah? Or posting something and then I'm getting likes and then I'm getting a dopamine hit, feeling good about myself. I don't have to deal with any of the ways that I feel ever if I don't want to, because I've got a device. So then they grow up like emotionally inept, because they don't need to deal. They don't even need, when they go to the toilet, doesn't even have to be a minute or two where you sit with yourself, because they sit on their phone. So they never have to sit with themselves. They never have to go, something's going on here, it doesn't feel very good, I need to find a solution, because every time that I stop, this comes up for me, right? And I don't know what to do with it. They don't have to do that. They just go, gone. So I think that's a huge problem, But then, it's kind of always been like that. When I was younger, it was the TV that was going to kill us, right? My mum used to say, you watch too much TV. Now I say to my kids, you're on your device too much, come and watch TV, right? So there is a bit of that that's been there. There is a bit of that that's been there. But, when I used to watch TV, there was only so much you could do, because it was videos, right? That's all you had when I was younger. And then the same would have been true. I saw a picture yesterday that said it was two pictures, one above the other, and it was a picture on a train, and it was like, we've ruined the society, and everyone on the train was on their phone. But then they went, or have we? Because it was a picture from, I don't know, it was a black and white picture, and everyone on the train was sat looking at their paper. So it was like, is it actually any different? Right, so there is a lot to be said for that, right? There is a lot to be said for that. But I do think that devices, unlike a paper, devices are made to be highly addictive, right? And, you didn't have a paper with you every single moment of the day. If you were waiting for a bus, for example, back then, you'd normally have to wait for a bus. But you don't have to now. To the point of, I was driving once and I saw a car had broke down, and there was a man stood next to the car. He was obviously waiting for the AA or whatever it was to pick him up, and he was just stood there like that. And I drove past him and thought, he looks like what? He looks really strange, and I couldn't figure out why. And in the end, I worked out it's because he wasn't on his phone. He's obviously thought, I'm just going to wait for this, and he stood there and he was just contemplating, and he looked strange, because you don't see it anymore. You don't see someone just stood contemplating, right? Because you don't have to.
you've given us so much to take away with that. You started with living in the present.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the main thing that's going to resonate with me. How do I actually forget all that rubbish and focus more on living in the present for those around me?
The answer to that question, I think, I think that's the age-old question, right? I think it's linked to the whole meaning of life. It's linked to everything. Because ultimately, I think it's really hard. So the moments I have of being really present with my children are actually quite fleeting. And that's why I know when I have them, they feel pretty special, right? Because even I take loads of pictures when I'm on holiday, right? When we're on the beach, I'm taking loads of pictures all the time, right? The reason I do that is because when we're actually on holiday,
Yeah, just what you've done to me this morning is that I wish to God that when you started speaking, I'd switch this device on and record it, because there's so much I want to think about and meditate on. That my poor old brain ain't holding it.
Well, it's being recorded over here, isn't it? I think the sound's being recorded. Yeah.
Because there's so much here to unpack, so much meat that I need slowly to digest.
Good, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I take loads of photos, right? Because when we're on holiday, I get a little bit stressed, a little bit overwhelmed, and I'm not present. And so I enjoy the holiday more when I'm looking at the photos. I'd never fully admit that to myself. But when we're looking at the photos, I'm like, no, we're at the beach. Look how good it was, so fun. When we were playing in the sea, it was amazing at the beach. But the reality is, when I'm there, I'm like a little bit like overwhelmed. Let's take loads of pictures. I'm gonna get the phone out, newspaper. Don't go to the sea, right? Because I'm not very present, yeah. And that's why I take loads of pictures, because then the holiday's fun when I get home, right? And I think that's true for a lot of my life. It's true for a lot of my life. And so, talked about meditation, any things that we can do to find ways to kind of slow the pace down. I talk a lot in the work that I do about space. Create space. We don't need big, massive fixes necessarily. Let's just take some stuff away every now and then. You know, in my house, I try and do device-free times. So for a couple of hours in the evening, no devices at the table. Let's have no devices for an hour. No one's allowed to go on their phone. My phone doesn't come in the bedroom. And when I'm with the kids, as much as I can, and I'd be lying if I said I did this all of the time, my phone goes off and it goes off on the shelf. Because the very notion of me being contactable, right, means that I'm not fully present. Because the very act of my phone being in my pocket. And there's levels of that as well, right? You know when you're talking to somebody and their phone's out and it rings and they look at it while you're talking and then they turn it upside down, face down. They don't put it away. It goes face down on the table. And you still think that phone's still not fully concentrating on what I'm saying, are you? Because your phone's there, right? And so the phone needs to be away and ultimately off. Because sometimes you'll be talking to someone and you see them go, you think, oh, your phone's ringing, isn't it? Like, I know you're not listening to me now because you're thinking, who's that? Right? So they're massively distracting. So to bring it back to the question, sorry, I know I rambled. Yeah, I think it's hard, and I think we have to do what we can to find ways, and a lot of that is about getting rid of distraction. And spaces like this, by the way, and I don't just say that, but spaces like this, because devices are, there's no devices here at the moment. We're all being curious and exploring and talking. And we can never lose the value in that, I don't think.
My curiosity, I think this has been one of the best sessions we've ever had.
I agree.
Thank you.
Fascinated to know what training you had for what you're doing now.
So I trained as a coach, which means I trained in kind of a technique called... it's that long ago, I can't remember what it's called. But it's basically about holding space for people, right? Coactive coaching it's called. Well, my mind went blank. So I trained in that. And originally what I started doing was one-on-one coaching people. So that's like holding space and helping them to be curious and explore themselves. So I started off doing that. And then, to be honest with you, what happened is I wanted to go into schools. I wanted my life to be going into schools and delivering to children. But schools are underfunded. And there's sort of I couldn't make a living from it, really. I couldn't do it full time because I wouldn't have been able to make money from it. So I went into the corporate environment where there's quite a bit of money And I call it my Peter Pan business plan. So when I go into the corporate environment, I charge them quite a lot of money, so that I can go into schools and all that and things like this, and I don't have to worry about money. So I get to do it full time and be in it because of the corporate work I do. So yeah, it's just evolved over the years, really. And it's got bigger over the last probably 2 years. During COVID, whenever all the companies went into lockdown, I started doing all of this online. Yeah, and kind of sort of did really well from that. So I've been able to do even more schools now, and that's always been the aim. So thank you. Go on.
You talked a lot when you were struggling about isolation, about not communicating. Was there any connection with the religious community?
There was not. I've never. So that's not strictly true. I went to AA when I first got sober, so I don't know how much you know about AA and the history of AA, but in my obsessive nature, I didn't just do AA. I went and found out everything about it. So AA originated from the Oxford group. So the 12 steps started as 6 steps. And there was something to, I haven't looked at this for years, but it was something to do with the Oxford group. And ultimately, the AA program has its origins in Christianity, and what they've done is they call it now a spiritual program, but ultimately it was born out of the 6 steps. I don't remember what the 6 steps are, but the 12 steps are ultimately the first step is to admit you're powerless over your whatever the drug is that you're using, and then you get to step 3, which is come to believe that a power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity. So you kind of make a commitment to understand that you're not God, and that there is at least something outside of yourself, bigger than you. Then step 4 and 5, you do like a moral inventory, and then you share that inventory with God as you understand it, and another human being. And then 7, 8, and 9 is you look at your quote unquote like shortcomings. You look at the things that you've done, and then you go into kind of amending the situation. So you go to all the people that you may have harmed or caused any harm to, and you kind of try to amend the situations. And then steps 11, 12, 11 is like improving your conscious contact with God as you understand it, through like prayer, meditation, and then 12 is carrying the message. So I think ultimately, from what I know from reading spiritual literature, it's kind of Christianity, isn't it? Right? It's kind of like born out of the concepts of that. So I did that for years. I did that for 5 or 6 years, AA groups.
But it sounded like you were just looking for love.
Exactly.
And that's what Christianity is.
Yeah. So I used to go to a Bible study as well, because I got heavily through the AA literature. I realized that it had its roots in the Bible. So then I went to the Bible and started reading the Bible. And I used to go to a Bible study, but there was lots of people that would go that didn't go to church. So I did that. So I kind of understand that Christianity is love, right? And ultimately, I think that is what you need. Yeah, it's all rooted in that. Yeah.
Okay, we more or less there on the questions, gentlemen.
Have I run over? I wasn't even sure what time I had to finish. I couldn't remember.
I think we're glad you run.